on?
Well, as we move on, historically move on, as well as move on to class. I mean, teaching or reading the history of philosophy is, it's not like, say, looking into the history of science or even mathematics, where there's a sense in which it's clear that knowledge is making progress. That is, that we know more. Incredible to say, but we know more about science, the nature of reality, than Newton did, or we know more about mathematics than Euclid did. Not that, we're smarter than Newton or Euclid, but rather that, there have been discoveries and revolutions and expansions in those things. It's harder to say that we make progress in something like our understanding of human nature, although, you could certainly make an argument to that case. It really depends on what you think. I mean, some people would say that Plato had it right, and some people would say that Thomas Aquinas had it really right, and that the mistake was culture generally straying from a Thomistic or a Platonic view of human nature. All we can really say about views of human nature, I think, is that they change, and that things that come later in some way or another have impacts on things that came before. Okay, that may be a little silly to say, but so Darwinism. I mean, as we move on historically, and ask ourselves, what was the Darwinian view of human nature? We have to remind ourselves. We're looking at the summary and conclusion from The Descent of Man, which was Darwin's second big book on evolution. The first being The Origin of Species, which was his general. He laid out the general theory and argument for his notion of evolution by way of natural selection, and then in the second big book applied those theories to an understanding of human origins and human nature. But generally speaking, we're talking about Darwinism here, and Darwinism. I think that Darwinism really is about two distinct but related concepts: evolution and natural selection. That is, if you believe, if you employ both of those concepts, the concept of evolution and the concept of natural selection, then you're a true Darwinian, because that's really the heart and soul of his theory of nature. Both of those things, but they are distinct, right? And both of them have an impact on our view of human nature in a distinct way. The notion of evolution is simply that species change, that all species change over time, that they evolve. This would be opposed to the notion that there are a fixed number of species and that they keep their nature or their natural kind forever. And that was really the dominant view before Darwin, although there were thinkers who believed in evolution, that is, who believed that species do change before Darwin, but that was a minority view. To believe in evolution is just to believe in species change. To believe that there's a mutation of species, that over long periods of time, and that's really important, right? That we're speaking in long, relative to human history, we're speaking in long periods of time, thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of years, that the species evolve over time, that the species are not fixed. And that's hard enough to accept in terms of humanity, because what it does, of course, imply is that there was a time on Earth when human beings did not yet exist, where their ancestor species existed. But they did not exist. That is, humanity is a product of nature, a chance product, really. And that it's probably the case that human beings will disappear either through extinction or through further evolution right? But species are temporary. So anybody who believes that species change and species are not fixed, species evolve from out of other species and evolve and go extinct or evolve into other species, is an evolutionist, not necessarily a Darwinian, because the second thing has to be in place too. Natural selection is Darwin's explanation of the mechanism of evolution. I mean, how does evolution actually occur? I mean, how does species change actually occur? And Darwin's answer, which is still controversial 150, 160 years later, is natural selection. The idea that, first of all, in nature, amongst any species, there's variety, that individuals differ from one another within a species, and that occasionally, novelties novel traits are introduced into a species through chance. We would say now through genetic mutation. And nature selects whatever traits are actually the good traits, which means the traits that help the individual to survive and reproduce, and deselect or reject any traits that make the individual less good at those things. It's the idea of fitness. So that over time, new traits will be, through this variety in individuals, new traits will be introduced into the population because they're successful. The individuals who have them will reproduce at a greater rate than the individuals who don't. And the introduction of these new traits is what gradually over time results in species change, because these individual traits gradually being introduced into a population has a cumulative effect where if enough small change goes on over a long period of time, it results in a big change where you can really say that the species is different. So I think that those two ideas have to be kept in mind. That is, and they give us a view of nature. On the one hand, no species is fixed. Every species comes from earlier species. So the human comes from the not human, you might say, which is itself a kind of a kick, right? I mean, to the way that human beings think of themselves, to think that, I mean, the traditional Christian and Jewish views that human beings were created in a separate act by God. The Darwinian view, which explicitly rejects any notion of a special creation, separate creation, simply says the human, whatever the human is, it comes from the not human. It comes from something before it, which was not human. The human has evolved out of the not human. That in itself changes our perspective on, I think, the human species. Couldn't help but do that. The second concept of natural selection also has a huge impact, because we sort of look at ourselves and look at our nature and we say, well, okay, the traits that I have were the traits that were chosen, and this is, of course, metaphorically chosen by nature, because they helped my ancestors to survive and reproduce. That is, that not just human beings, but every living thing has to be seen as a result of a long process of natural selection. So all of its traits it has because those traits helped the individuals in earlier periods survive and reproduce. So they all have a functional value for the species. So, okay, I have these traits, let's say. I mean, if I look at myself physically, for instance, if I look at my opposable thumbs, my hands, it's quite easy to see, not easy, but it intuitively it says, well, why do I have these opposable thumbs? Because they help my ancient ancestors survive and reproduce, because they're very useful. Other physical characteristics may be true as well, but as we see with Darwin, the really radical thing is to look at our intellectual and moral capabilities as being a result of natural selection too. That's where we get into territory that is a lot closer to home.